So I decided to talk about this because I've been getting a lot of questions, emails, and people coming up to me after services and things like that, talking about anxiety and fear and all that kind of stuff. And there's no doubt that people have a lot to worry about these days. I'm not going to go into them because you don't need me to remind you what you're anxious about, probably. But, some people are prone to this just because of their past karma or genetics or whatever you want to call that. And I should mention, in case someone comes up and is talking to you about anxieties that they're having and things like that there are some really good counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists out there. My wife is a mental health professional. She reminded me that I should mention this when I talk about these things. And a lot of what we're going to do today deals with anxiety and that sort of thing, mainly as a symptom. So not so much root causes, but some strategies just for dealing with what comes up. And by the way, you might notice that I'm dressed a little differently than I usually am. I'm not in robes. This is called a samu. When I wear this to Walmart, people think I'm there for a karate class. But this basically, it means work clothes. And so like at retreats and services when we're not actually on the dais, this is kind of what we wear. The reason I'm wearing it today is that I'm going to have you get up and move, and I'm going to demonstrate the way I want you to move. And it's a lot, we're not going to work up a sweat, but it's a lot easier to see what I'm doing if I'm not in robes. So I have kind of a history with anxiety. My father was, some of you have heard me talk about my father before. He was a rough character, to say the least. And home life when I was growing up was unsafe, no doubt about it. There was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of trauma. And so by the time I was, say, 18, I was really completely overwhelmed by social anxiety. My first main job, I delivered office supplies. And driving around in a van was no problem, but getting out of the van and walking into an office and asking someone to sign an invoice was just almost more than I could handle. I mean, it was that bad. And back then, therapy was kind of hard to get to. It was expensive and it wasn't available to everybody. And I'm kind of sorry that I didn't get it because it probably held me back for a long time. But I had to make do, and I'd say that my interest in religion and spirituality and yoga and meditation and things like that really probably helped me keep it together. But, no amount of contemplative practice was going to fix the trauma without other work. So I say this because if you or someone you know needs help and is in a position to get professional help, I would encourage you to do that. So Japanese psychology was really helpful to me later on as I kind of started processing some of this stuff. And I encountered that when I was in my mid-20s. And one of the principles of Japanese psychology is something that we might call the psychology of action, which includes taking purposeful action. And this actually emerged out of forms of Buddhist practice that were prevalent in Japan, which is kind of how Japanese psychology got on my radar. I was trying to study Zen and stuff like that, and there weren't really places for me to go at that point. And so I was reading everything I could get my hands on, and so I found some things about, Zen-based psychotherapies and started reading about that and doing some of the practices. And so several years ago, probably maybe 7 years ago now, I got a certification in methods of Japanese psychology. And I started working through that certificate program really as a complement to what I was doing as a Buddhist minister. And I thought it might help me with individuals who were going through life issues, and it does. And I discovered that it also enhanced my ability to connect the Buddha's teachings to day-to-day life issues, which is kind of my main goal as a minister, as a Zen teacher, and so on, is to help you apply these things to your life. So I'm mostly grounded in two different things, Shin or Jodo Shinshu Buddhism and Zen. So Shin Buddhism is based on this concept of other power. The idea is that you can't do much of anything without help from others. You can't make spiritual progress solely on your own. And so when you're looking for a way out of suffering, one of the things you do is look beyond yourself. What is out there that can help you to transcend your ego and the suffering associated with that. And so some of you have experience doing Nikon with me, and that comes from Shin Buddhism. That comes from that side. I'm not going to go into that today because it's a whole other topic, but the other side, the Zen side, stresses something called self-power, Jiriki. And the idea is that you can't make spiritual progress without making a personal effort. And so when you're searching for a way out of stress and suffering, your search is really down to earth, here where the rubber meets the road. So it's, what am I doing? So on the surface, these two things can seem to clash with one another. But when we look at how they work in this greater context of Buddhist practice, we find that they balance one another really well and support one another. So I actually decided to study Japanese psychology after I got to know Greg Creech, who heads up one of the Todo Institute, which is one of the very small number of places in the U.S. where you can train in these things. But I had initially discovered it in the mid-'80s, and I was reading a book by a guy named David K. Reynolds, who was a psychologist and writer who had gone to Japan to study this stuff. And I found it really helpful in dealing with some of my issues, like especially anxiety around social situations and that kind of thing. And this was especially true of what Reynolds called constructive living, which we can say means living purposefully, making our life choices based on what is going to really align with our highest values. And so it comes from the Zen-based side of psychology. The main thread comes from there was a Japanese psychologist named Shoma Morita who developed this thing that's now called Morita therapy. And he took things that came out of his Zen practice and applied them to treating a specific kind of anxiety disorder that they identify in Japan. And his work influenced a number of Western psychologists, including existential feminist psychologist Karen Horney and Albert Ellis, who is kind of the father of cognitive behavior therapy. So the self-power aspect of this is pretty much about what you do, and is concerned very little about what you feel or changing what you feel. So he said feelings are not the problem, which is kind of interesting. We tend in our society to want to feel a certain way, and a lot of the time we treat the way we feel. And he said that's kind of missing the point. It doesn't mean feelings are irrelevant. A lot of people, who come to me want to practice Buddhism and stuff, seem to think that, if you meditate enough and all of that, you won't feel anything. And that's actually not the case. There's a lot of interesting misperceptions about Zen. And another one of them is that you go around saying cryptic things and feeling serene all the time. But it's really about living authentically. It's about recognizing your mental states as a part of kind of who you are and what you do, and not rejecting them. So one of the things that Morita imported from Zen is that emotions, even unpleasant ones, are natural. And by the way, when I use the word emotion, there's a Buddhist psychologist, Padmasiri de Silva, who defines emotions as the meaning that we apply to the felt states of arousal. In other words, there's a physical sensation or a set of sensations, and then we apply thoughts and values to those sensations. So when we look at the Western model of psychology, where there's a lot of focus on how you feel about things. In fact, there's this kind of stereotypical dialogue between a therapist and a patient, where the therapist asks repeatedly, how did you feel about that? And we're even told, like in conflict management and active listening courses and stuff, that to phrase things in terms of our feelings. When you don't take out the trash, I feel, whatever. And so we focus a lot of energy on what we're feeling. And then we either try to change the way we feel or we try to change the circumstance that we feel badly about. But Morita considered emotions, this internal experience of thoughts and sensations, to be symptoms, not problems. And if we give a lot of attention to our symptoms, then they start to predominate our awareness. So we don't want to ignore them or pretend they're not there. He said what we should do is coexist with our internal experience and then take purposeful action. So rather than asking ourselves, how do I feel about this? We ask ourselves, what do I need to be doing? So let me give you a personal example of how this kind of thing works. So a lot of people have at least some anxiety about speaking in public. And I mentioned my issues with anxiety before, and that was especially bad about public speaking. I was practically incapable of it. In fact, I made it through an MBA program somehow without hardly ever standing up in front of the class and saying anything. Even though it was a very discussion-oriented program, somehow I still managed to graduate without talking much in class because I was terrified of it. I eventually got over that because there were things I wanted to say. So I couldn't psych myself into feeling calm, which is what people say you should do, the whole picture your audience naked thing. I don't want to see you naked. I'm sorry. Another personal. Well, some of you maybe. But anyway. What I had to learn to do was accept that I was going to be nervous. And I could get up and give a talk anyway. And once I did that, the anxiety started to drop off quite a bit. And with practice and experience, I got less nervous. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. This actually just came to me as I was talking. This was probably 25 years ago. I gave a talk about a technique that a friend of mine had suggested to some of his people he coached and some of his patients and clients. And he talked about doing shame attacking exercises, which is where you deliberately do something that gets you outside of your comfort zone. Deliberately, so people will look at you like you're nuts. And then you accept the fact that people look at you like you're nuts, but that doesn't mean you're nuts. And so one of the things that he would have people do is get into an elevator and call out the floors, with a loud voice. So you're in an elevator and some guy standing next to you going, 3, and you would do this and people would go, this guy's crazy. And you would see that you survived that. So I gave this talk that involved a lot of standing up, walking around, writing on a whiteboard, all this stuff. This was in a business coaching kind of situation. And then I sat down and I realized that my pants had been unzipped that entire time. And so I just kind of sat there and wondered, did they think I did that on purpose? Anyway, I was asked to give the invocation at a county commission meeting the first time probably 5 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that, and I accepted. And by then I was giving multiple Dharma talks a week, and I was doing this kind of thing a lot. And so I showed up at the commission meeting, actually looking forward to this. I was in a jacket and tie and raksu, and I was going to say a 2-minute prayer. And the time came, the chair called me to the podium, and I stood up, and my knees were weak, and my heart was beating, and my hands were shaking, my mouth was dry. So at one time, that would have totally freaked me out. I would have gotten really upset about being anxious and been telling myself how terrible it was that I felt that way. But this time, because I've done a lot of Buddhist practice and all of that by then, I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm anxious. And I got up and I said this 2-minute prayer. I focused on what needed to be done, despite how I felt about what needed to be done. And, as a result, the only people who knew I was nervous was me. So I've done these things probably a number of times since then. Every 6 months or a year or so, they'll invite me to come in and give the invocation. And usually, over time, got a lot more comfortable with that. But it happened again last week. And it was the first time I'd been there since before COVID. And so I wasn't expecting it. I stood up to go give the prayer, and my knees were a little shaky and my heart was beating a little fast. I thought, well, that's interesting. It's nice to know that I still have a comfort zone that I can get out of. So within this paradigm of accepting feelings as natural, you can consider yourself cured more or less when you can take the action that you need to take, not when you change the symptoms. When we take care of our lives, our feelings tend to take care of themselves. And in fact, behavior kind of influences feelings. So I mentioned David K. Reynolds, the guy who studied Morita therapy and then brought it to the West. He had this experience as a graduate student that kind of changed the way he saw things, and that sort of precipitated his interest in this stuff. He was doing a research project on what it was like to be a mental patient. And so he decided he would get, as part of this, he would go into a mental hospital of some kind, psychiatric hospital. And in order to do this, he had to pretend to be a depressed person. So he studied the things that depressed people do and say and all of that kind of stuff, and he performed them. And he went in and he spent some period of several months in this hospital as a depressed person. And when he got out, he was depressed. He had never been depressed before, but now he was. And it took several months for him with therapy to get over what he had caused to himself. And he said, we need to, this is important. This is something important that we've learned here. Acting a certain way, if we lead with the body, the mind will follow. So one of the strategies for dealing with anxiety and worry and stuff like that is to lead with the body. Focus on what needs to be done and then do that. And very often the mind is going to come along for the ride and catch up to the body eventually. It also helps to recognize that unpleasant emotions are often symptoms of something good about us. The desire to do well when you're going to give a talk, for instance, or when you're, going into a new job or entering into some new situation, is a symptom of you wanting to do this well, and that's a good thing about you. So rather than trying to change how you feel, you develop the skills that will help you live a better life. And so part of that is to work skillfully with our attention, and that's where things like mindfulness practice can come in. So the serenity that people associate with Zen comes largely from the emphasis on acceptance. That doesn't mean that everything is okay, and sometimes people will get confused about that. It means that we do better when we accept our thoughts and emotions, and when we accept reality as it is, which includes accepting that there are things that we can't control. We can't control the traffic, as much as I try every Sunday morning on my way when I come up here, I tell these people in front of me to go faster, but that's one of those things we can't control. We can't control the weather, natural disasters. We can't control our past. We can't control our future. We might influence the future. We might influence other people. We might influence how long we live and that sort of thing. But we have no control over it. We also can't really control our thoughts and sensations. We can train ourselves, we can develop habits and things like that, but we can't will our thoughts and feelings to be a certain way. If you don't believe me, try sitting for 5 minutes without having any thoughts. It just doesn't work. Thoughts arise. They're not really ours to control. But we have control over our actions to a great extent. And that doesn't mean we're always going to be able to do exactly what we want to do. But with practice and effort, we can get closer and closer to doing what serves our highest purpose. So one strategy is to shift to something happening in the here and now. And a direct way to do that is to focus on what's coming in through the sense doors, which is why I had you do that meditation earlier, where you meditated on what's happening through the senses. So if you're looking at what do I see, that's here, that's now. What am I feeling physically? That's here, right now. So a lot of our anger and regret and things like that, that's back there. A lot of our anxiety and our worry, that's out there. And both of those are areas that we can't control. So why not put your attention someplace where you can control what's going on, which would be, what am I doing? So there's a couple of other things that I'll suggest that is you can kind of take away with you. One of them is something you're doing right now. You're outside in nature. There's a whole thing called ecotherapy that's been studied, especially in Europe and the UK, where they've measured and said, that being outside where you can see trees and stuff like that is really effective in dealing with some things like anxiety and depression. Morita, as part of Morita therapy, he would have people go out and work in the yard, which was probably really good for Morita. But it was also good for them. Being outside and being active really helped these people who he was treating overcome a lot of their anxiety and depression. Going for walks and things like that, especially if you can do it in nature. That's a very beneficial experience. So I'm going to show you some Qigong stuff. And the reason I'm going to show you this is because the things that I'm going to show you are very... what time is it? I can do it in just a couple minutes. All right. And they're very easy to learn. And also, there's some online tutorials about this particular sequence that if you want to learn the rest of them, is pretty easy to do. Qigong and yoga and stuff like that have been tested quite a bit with like veterans organizations on how to deal with PTSD in veterans, and have been found to be very, very helpful. More helpful than like sitting meditation, where a lot of time if you're not used to sitting meditation and you do it, you'll just meditate a lot on what you're anxious about. And this will help get you beyond that. So I'm going to show you, and also, so I've taught a couple of semesters of contemplative practices at Stetson. And I've had several students come to me and tell me that they've been struggling with anxiety for years and years, and this was the only thing that they could do that would really help them to deal with the anxiety fairly quickly and completely. So, stand up. Is this going to feedback if I'm in front of well, if it does, I'll jump back there. So, there's 8 of these. I'm going to show you 2 of them. These are real easy to learn. You want to make sure that you're at least 4 or 5 feet from anybody else, so just kind of spread out a little bit. So stand with your feet about shoulder width apart. So this is called holding up the heavens. So kind of bend your knees slightly so you sort of sit down. Interlock your fingers. And then inhale, lifting. And when your hands get to about shoulder height, push up and look up. And then exhale and come back down. Interlock your fingers, inhale. Exhale. So the key to doing this is to synchronize the breath and the movement. Exhale. It doesn't really matter whether you're inhaling or exhaling as long as you synchronize the breath and the movement. And if you sort of straighten and bend your knees so your center rises and falls, that adds a little to it. And then come back with your hands kind of like a circle in front of you. And then you're going to lift your left hand and push your right hand down. So breathe in, left hand overhead. Breathe out. If you get them reversed, it doesn't really matter. Inhale. Exhale. One more each side. And then keep your left hand where it is and bring your right hand down by your hip. We'll do one more. So as you inhale, rotate your palms out and look to your left. Exhale back to center. To your right. And back. Let's do one more each side. How'd that feel? Good. I like it too. All right. Thank you.